We are going to dot every I and cross every T until we find out what happened to Nolan Wells. Somebody saw something. Somebody knows something.
We received audio from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources on Friday related to the Nolan Wells case. That recording, a call made from a teen on a boat at Horn Island on July 4th at around 4 p.m. to a private towing company. Wells traveled out on that boat with friends for the holiday, but he did not return with them. He was reported missing that night, and his body was found just off the island 2 days later. Let's listen to that call.
Right, looks like you're on Horn Island, correct? Are you
yes,
on
we are
Horn
at Horn
Island?
Island. Yes.
All right. Is the boat sinking or you have it aground?
We were sinking, yes.
Is it aground is the question?
No, we're not aground. We are in 17 foot of water. We're in 31 foot of water.
Yep, I just need you to answer these questions so I can get you over to the captain.
Okay.
How many adults on board?
There are 0 adults on board.
There's nobody on board the boat?
No. Nobody here is over the age of 21.
Sir, that was not the question. Is there a person? Is there a person, a living individual on the boat?
Hello?
Is there a living person, someone breathing on the boat? Is there anybody on the boat?
Yes, there's lots of people breathing on the boat.
All right, how many people, sir?
Like 7.
A boat radios for help. The caller says they're sinking, bilge pump dead, water rising, panic in his voice. The GPS tells a different story. For the next 53 minutes, that sinking boat crawls across open water at walking pace, then suddenly races for shore the moment land comes into view. One person who left the dock that day never made it back. So what happened in the time between that call and the moment the boat reached shore? Over the next few minutes, the full call, the GPS data investigators still haven't explained, and 2 autopsies that still don't agree on how he died. Welcome back to Case Alert HQ. Today's case, the death of Nolan Wells on Horn Island, Mississippi. Now, let's get into it. Before we go any further, hit subscribe. Cases like this move fast once new evidence surfaces, and subscribing is the only way you catch the next confirmed update the moment it drops, instead of finding out days later. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, born and raised in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. He played wide receiver for Southwest Mississippi Community College and was preparing to report back for the coming football season. He was set to turn 19 within weeks. For Nolan and his friends, the 4th of July on Horn Island wasn't a one-off trip. It was tradition. Horn Island sits about 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, a barrier island with no docks, no shelters, no cell service, reachable only by boat. Every year, the same group made the crossing to spend the holiday there. Nolan had done it before. The year prior, he had been on that same stretch of coastline, with some of the same people, on the same kind of boat, celebrating the same holiday. July 4, 2026 was supposed to be more of the same. One detail about that day has shaped how the country has followed this case. Nolan was black. Most of the friends he traveled with that day were white. Photos from the trip, later circulated widely online, showed him surrounded by that group, and for a case unfolding in Mississippi, a state with a difficult history on race, that image alone was enough to draw national attention and raise hard questions for people watching from outside the community. Not everyone agrees that race is central to what happened. Some local officials, and some of the friends who were there that day, have pushed back on the idea that race played any role at all. That disagreement has not been resolved, and it is part of why this case has drawn coverage far beyond Mississippi. What is certain is this: Nolan went to Horn Island that day. He did not come home. On the morning of July 4th, Nolan left from a private dock area in Ocean Springs, traveling by boat with a group of friends toward Horn Island. It was the same crossing this group had made before, the same kind of holiday gathering that had brought them there in years past. By early afternoon, the group had reached the island, joining crowds of other boaters making the same holiday trip. He was last seen on the island around 3 that afternoon, wearing blue swim trunks and sunglasses. That is the last documented description of Nolan before the group's plans changed. When the boats eventually turned back toward the mainland, Nolan was not on one of them. According to Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter, the official account is straightforward. He told investigators his friends left the island and returned home without Nolan because, in the sheriff's words, Nolan chose to stay behind. That single sentence has become the most contested detail in the entire case. Family attorney Ben Crump has laid out the problem directly. Accounts from people who were on the island that day do not agree with each other. One version has Nolan telling a young woman he was talking with that he was heading back to rejoin his friends on the boat. A separate version, from members of the friend group, has Nolan saying the opposite, that he planned to stay behind and continue talking with her. Both versions cannot be true at the same time. Someone's account of Nolan's last known plan is wrong, whether by mistake or by something else entirely. Investigators have not said which version they believe, and no one has been able to reconcile the two. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The boat that carried Nolan to Horn Island left without him. His friends made it back to the mainland that evening. Nolan did not. He had no phone and no keys with him when the group departed. Whatever happened between the moment his plans allegedly changed and the moment his friends decided to leave without him has never been fully explained, by anyone, on the record. That gap, the space between two contradictory accounts and one confirmed outcome, is where the investigation into Nolan Wells' death actually begins. By that night, Nolan still had not come home. Just after midnight, his mother, Christine Wansley, reported him missing to the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. What followed was a search involving local, state, and federal agencies, along with volunteers combing the water and shoreline around Horn Island. The island itself made the search difficult, federally protected wilderness, uninhabited, with no roads or infrastructure, reachable only by boat. For 2 days, there was no sign of him. His family waited through both nights without an answer, as searchers worked the water and shoreline in shifts. On the morning of July 6, a National Park Service agent working the shoreline found Nolan's body in the water, face down, near the northwestern tip of Horn Island, close to where he had last been seen 2 days earlier. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind examined the scene. His initial assessment, given publicly in the days that followed, was direct. There were no immediate, obvious signs of foul play or trauma on Nolan's body. Lind also pointed to context. His office has handled numerous drowning cases from Mississippi's barrier islands over the years, and the currents around Horn Island are known to be rough. It is a plausible explanation for how someone could end up in that water. On its own, though, it is an incomplete one. That statement matters, because it cuts against any simple explanation. It does not confirm an accident. It does not rule one out. Lind himself said the uncertainty was exactly why his office requested a full autopsy from the state medical examiner, so that investigators could determine, with more than a visual examination, whether trauma or foul play had played any part in Nolan's death. In other words, the case did not open with a clear answer. It opened with an absence of one. A visible body, recovered from the water, showing nothing on the surface to explain how he got there. That question, how Nolan Wells ended up in the water off Horn Island, is the question every subsequent piece of evidence in this case has tried, and so far failed, to answer. Before we go further, it helps to understand what kind of call this actually was. Sea Tow is not an emergency line. It is a private, membership-based towing company for boats, closer to roadside assistance than to 911. A call to Sea Tow does not automatically notify the Coast Guard or local law enforcement. There is no requirement to flag anything unusual to authorities. It exists to get a broken-down boat back to shore, nothing more. That call was placed around 4 in the afternoon on July 4, roughly an hour after Nolan was last seen with the group. The caller was one of Nolan's friends, operating a boat near the western tip of Horn Island. He told the sea tow dispatcher, a woman named Vicky, that the boat's bilge pump had failed and that they were taking on water, and asked for help getting back to shore. What followed was confused from the start. Vicky asked for a membership number to process the request. The caller did not have one. He offered his grandfather's name instead, though he struggled to get it out clearly. Vicky asked for GPS coordinates, and the caller had to leave the phone to go find them, the call breaking up on a bad connection the entire time. Then came the moment that has drawn the most attention since the recording became public. Vicky asked whether everyone on board was in good health. The caller answered without hesitation that everyone was fine. When she asked how many people were aboard, his answer only added confusion. He said there were no children on the boat, and separately, that no one on board was over the age of 21. It took another round of questions before he clarified, around 7 people, all with life jackets accessible, on a 22-foot Triton. Vicky declined his request for the Coast Guard when she offered it, then transferred the call to a local sea tow captain, identified in the recording as Seth. Seth told Vicky he had already spoken separately with the boat owner's grandfather. Multiple outlets that later obtained and reported on the recording identified that grandfather as Jerry Atkerson, a sea tow member. According to the captain, Atkerson said the situation had already been resolved and that his family did not need sea tow's help after all. On that basis, Seth set the call aside and moved on to dispatch a boat for a different member entirely. It's worth being precise about what this recording does and does not establish. It captures real confusion, a struggling teenager trying to relay an emergency, and a call that ultimately went nowhere. It does not, on its own, explain what happened to Nolan, who was not on this boat and had already been left on the island by this point in the account. The recording itself did not surface right away. It stayed inside Sea Tow's own records for weeks before NBC News obtained it through a records request and made it public. Until that point, the only people who had heard this exchange were the ones on the call itself. Nolan's family was not among them. One name connected to that day deserves a factual introduction here: Warren Hudson, a friend of Nolan's since the 8th grade. Hudson was not on the boat that placed this particular sea tow call. In a later podcast interview, he said he had spent time with Nolan earlier that day, checking on him periodically, and that Nolan seemed fine each time. Hudson said he ultimately returned to the mainland on a different boat, one that also began taking on water that afternoon, and confirmed that the friend heard on the sea tow recording helped his group when their boat ran into trouble. Hudson has also said, consistent with the sheriff's account, that Nolan chose to stay behind on the island rather than return with the group. None of this resolves the central question. It only adds detail to the hour surrounding it: a boat in genuine mechanical trouble, a chaotic call for help that Sea Tow ultimately did not act on, and a friend group that made it back to shore without the one person this entire case is about. Investigators have one piece of evidence in this case that does not rely on anyone's memory: GPS tracking data recovered from the boat itself by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Most modern boats carry a GPS chart plotter that logs position, speed, and time automatically, without anyone on board doing anything to record it. Investigators pulled this data directly from the vessel's own system rather than relying on witness recollection, which is part of why it carries more weight than the conflicting accounts described earlier in this case. Where the Sea Tow call was full of confusion and half-answers, this record offers something colder and more exact: numbers that don't change no matter who is asked to explain them. That data lays out a timeline. The boat left a private dock on El Camino Real Road in Ocean Springs at roughly 9:56 that morning and arrived at Horn Island by 11:14. It stayed there through the afternoon, through the last confirmed sighting of Nolan around 3 p.m., through the Sea Tow call placed just after 4. At 4:31 p.m., the GPS shows the boat leaving Horn Island. Nolan was not on it. From there, the record gets more complicated. The boat returned to its original dock. More than an hour later, it traveled to an area called Fort Bayou at 5:52 p.m., came back to the dock by 6:06, and by 7:19 p.m. had reached the Fort Bayou boat launch. Sometime after that, it was pulled from the water and transported over land to the boat owner's residence in Biloxi. None of these later movements have been publicly explained in detail. Investigators have not said why the boat made multiple separate trips after returning from the island, what each stop was for, where the vessel or its occupants were during the gap after 4:31 p.m., or why several hours passed between leaving Horn Island and the boat coming out of the water for the night. Those are open questions. They are not accusations, and no official account has offered a full answer to any of them yet. The GPS record does include one useful detail. According to the Department of Marine Resources report, the boat's owner, the owner's mother, and another individual who had been with Nolan that day were cooperating with investigators as the report was compiled. The report itself covers only through July 5, the point at which the Jackson County Sheriff's Office took over as the lead agency on the case. The timeline also sits uneasily against something Nolan's own father has said publicly. Asked whether he believed his son chose to stay behind, Elmore Wansley pushed back directly, saying Nolan always stays with the group. That is the tension at the center of this chapter of the case. A confirmed departure time, logged automatically and not dependent on memory. A string of later movements nobody has fully accounted for. And a family who does not accept the explanation they've been given for why their son wasn't on that boat when it left the island. If you are still with us at this point, drop a comment that says I am still here. This is where the case stops being simple, and it helps to know how many of you are following it all the way through. There is one piece of evidence in this case that belonged to Nolan directly, and the story of how his family got it back raises its own questions. On the evening of July 4th, before Nolan had even been reported missing, his family used a phone locator app to track down his device. It led them to the home of one of his friends. That is where they recovered it. When they went through it afterward, his family said something was missing. Nolan, according to his relatives, was an active Snapchat user, the kind of teenager who documented most of his day. But the roughly 24 hours before his family got the phone back contained no posts, no messages, nothing. A gap, in a digital record that otherwise should have been constant. The family has publicly alleged that messages appeared to have been erased from the phone before it reached them. That allegation has never been independently confirmed, and it has never been disproven either. It sits, like much of this case, in the space between suspicion and proof. What happened next is unusual on its own. Attorneys representing Nolan's family agreed to a joint inspection of the phone alongside investigators from the district attorney's office, working together to determine what, if anything, could still be recovered from it. A law professor consulted on the arrangement noted that this kind of cooperation is not how evidence normally works. Evidence is typically secured by one side and simply is not shared this way. That the two sides agreed to examine it together says something about how much weight both sides are placing on what that phone might still hold. As of now, that joint inspection has not taken place. The device that might explain the missing day before Nolan disappeared is still sitting unopened, waiting on a process that has not yet started. 3 weeks into this case, there is still no official cause of death, no official manner of death, and no autopsy report available to the public. Instead, there are two separate examinations, conducted independently of each other, and neither one has landed on an answer. The first is the official autopsy, performed by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office on July 7, one day after Nolan's body was recovered. That report has not been released. It is still pending toxicology results, the lab testing that checks for substances like alcohol or drugs in the body, and until those results come back, the office has not issued formal conclusions. In any death investigation, a medical examiner works toward two rulings: a cause of death, the specific medical reason someone died, and a manner of death, a broader classification such as natural, accident, homicide, suicide, or undetermined. For Nolan, neither has been publicly settled by either autopsy. The State Medical Examiner's Office has spoken publicly about the process, if not the findings, saying its autopsy followed standard procedures and protocols. It also urged the public to remain patient and avoid drawing conclusions before the investigation is complete, cautioning that unfounded speculation can create real obstacles for investigators. There is also a new detail now part of the record. According to a preliminary Mississippi Department of Marine Resources document dated July 5, compiled the day before Nolan's body was found, witnesses told investigators that Nolan had been drinking heavily with friends on Horn Island that day. That detail did not come from either autopsy. It came from an internal search document, only made public in the past day. On its own, it does not establish anything about how Nolan died. But it is exactly the kind of detail toxicology testing exists to confirm or rule out, and it is now something both the state's investigation and, eventually, the grand jury will have to weigh. The second examination is an independent autopsy, commissioned separately by Nolan's family. It was conducted by forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell and funded by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick. Family attorney Ben Crump presented the preliminary findings at a national conference in Chicago in late July. The conclusion, read aloud that day, mirrored the uncertainty of the state's own case: cause of death undetermined, manner of death undetermined, pending further investigation. Mitchell's report did note one specific finding: an area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. By the time this second autopsy was performed, Nolan's body had already undergone a meaningful degree of decomposition, which limited how thoroughly Mitchell could examine it. Decomposition is one of the most common obstacles in cases like this. Bodies recovered from water after several days are naturally harder to examine than bodies found soon after death, and that reality applies to every drowning-related investigation, not just this one. Because of that limitation, Mitchell's report described the discoloration but stopped short of explaining its cause. That distinction matters, and it's worth being precise about it here. A forensic pathologist not connected to this case at all, asked to weigh in on the finding, said the discoloration could represent ordinary changes from decomposition, or it could reflect an injury to the back of the head and neck. Both are medically plausible. Neither has been confirmed. The finding raises a real question without answering it. Mitchell's report also raised a broader point that applies to the entire case: when a death may involve drowning and the person who died was a capable swimmer, as Nolan was, establishing exactly how that person entered the water becomes essential, not optional. Without that answer, a drowning ruling and a homicide both remain technically on the table. One additional detail became public alongside the independent autopsy's release: parts of Nolan's throat had been retained by the state medical examiner's office during its own autopsy. That can sound alarming, but the independent report itself noted that retaining tissue this way is a common, accepted forensic practice, used to allow further examination later if needed. What both autopsies agree on is the absence of an answer. Two separate pathologists, working independently, with different resources and different levels of access to a body that had already begun to decompose, reached the same open conclusion. Neither has ruled out an accident. Neither has ruled out something else. The state's toxicology results, still pending, may be the piece that finally moves this case out of that uncertainty, one way or another. Until then, the honest description of how Nolan Wells died is the same one investigators have used from the beginning: unknown. While the forensic questions remain unresolved, a separate process has been moving forward, the legal one. It has produced fewer headlines than the audio or the autopsies, but it may ultimately matter more. On July 15, Nolan's family met for the first time with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath. She told them plainly what to expect going forward. Every non-natural death in the county is presented to a grand jury, and Nolan's case will be no different. A grand jury does not decide guilt. Its job is narrower: to review the evidence investigators and prosecutors present and decide whether there is enough to bring formal criminal charges against anyone at all. It meets privately, without the press or the public present, and its process runs on its own schedule, not on public pressure. That grand jury will ultimately decide whether the evidence supports criminal charges against anyone. McElrath also explained that, under standard procedure, neither the family nor the public will see the state's autopsy report until the grand jury has reviewed the case. Her office has framed that restriction as a way of protecting the investigation, not withholding the truth from the people asking for it. The investigation itself has grown well beyond local law enforcement. Sheriff John Ledbetter has confirmed that the FBI is assisting with digital evidence review, the kind of work that includes phones, location data, and any other electronic records tied to the day Nolan disappeared. That federal involvement typically brings additional lab resources and technical capability that a county sheriff's office would not otherwise have access to on its own. As of the most recent public update, investigators have interviewed roughly 60 witnesses. That number alone tells you this is not a small or contained inquiry. It is a wide net, still being pulled in, spanning everyone who was on the water that day and many who weren't. Outside the investigation itself, the case has drawn national figures into Nolan's story. On July 20th, a memorial service was held in Ocean Springs. Nolan's father, Elmore Wansley, attended alongside family attorney Ben Crump and civil rights leader Reverend Al Sharpton, who spoke at the service. Their presence turned what began as a local tragedy into a case with a national audience watching its every development. That national attention has also produced a concrete incentive. A reward of $125,000 is now being offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction in the case. It was jointly funded by Sharpton, entertainment executive Tyler Perry, and former NFL player Terrell Owens. Whatever else remains unresolved here, that reward is a signal of how seriously people well outside Mississippi are treating this case. Then there is the step Nolan's mother took entirely on her own. Christine Wansley filed in court to be formally named administrator of her son's estate. It was not accompanied by a press conference or a public statement. It was a legal filing, the kind of paperwork most people never expect to have to complete for a child. Under Mississippi law, without that filing, she has no formal legal standing over her son's affairs, no matter how clearly she is his mother. The system required her to prove something in writing that should never have needed proving at all. Taken together, these developments show a case moving on two tracks at once. One is public, the memorial, the reward, the attention from national figures. The other is procedural, slower, and largely invisible, witness interviews, digital forensics, and a grand jury process that runs on its own timeline, regardless of how much pressure builds outside it. Nolan's family is now navigating both. They have shown up publicly, again and again, since July 4th. And quietly, in a courthouse, without cameras, his mother has been doing the paperwork nobody warns you about. Strip away everything else, and here is where this case actually stands. Confirmed, Nolan Wells went to Horn Island on July 4th and did not return with the group he arrived with. His body was recovered 2 days later. A sea tow call was placed from a nearby boat during the window investigators are focused on. GPS records show that same boat's movements for hours afterward, some of them still unexplained. 2 autopsies have each returned the same open verdict, undetermined. Pending, the state's toxicology results, which could finally answer whether anything in Nolan's system played a role in his death, including the recent witness accounts of heavy drinking on the island that day. A grand jury proceeding, which has no scheduled date and moves only when the district attorney's office decides the investigation is ready. And a joint inspection of Nolan's phone, agreed to by both sides weeks ago, that still has not happened. Any one of those 3 could change what we actually know about this case. None of them has landed yet. What moves this forward from here isn't speculation. It's toxicology results becoming public. It's a grand jury actually convening. It's that phone finally being opened by people with the authority to examine it properly. Everything else, for now, is still a question mark. Nolan Wells was 18. He went to the water with his friends on a holiday he'd celebrated the same way before. He did not come home, and more than 3 weeks later, his family still does not have an official answer for why. A mother has filed to represent her own son's estate. A father has publicly disputed the explanation he was given. That alone tells you this case is far from settled, no matter what any single piece of evidence eventually shows. This is an active investigation, not a closed file, which means the next real development could come at any time, from any one of these open threads. This case is still developing. The next confirmed update, whether it is the toxicology results, the grand jury, or that phone inspection, could land at any time. Subscribe now, so you hear it the moment it is verified, not days after everyone else already has.